Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Journey to Thrive podcast at Saint John Vianney Center's Day of Prayer for the health and wellness of clergy and men and women religious. Our theme this year is God Knows You Completely. And it's a reminder that no matter what we face, the challenges, the weariness, the questions that come with ministry, God sees every part of who we are and still calls us his beloved. Today, I'm joined by several of my teammates here at Saint John Vianney Center who accompany clergy and religious in that very truth every day. So today, I'd like to welcome Deacon Steven DeMartino, our Director of Consultation Services. Welcome, Deacon Steve.
Thank you. Thank you, Deacon James. Nice to be here.
Great to have you back. And I'd like to welcome Kristin Lincoln-Ellzy, our Manager of Continuing Care Services. Welcome, Kristin.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to also welcome Sister Mary Lindsay, one of our licensed psychologists in our outpatient services. Welcome, Sister.
Thank you, Jim. Good to be here.
And last but certainly not least, Dr. Jim Coupe, our clinical director. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks, Deacon Jim. Happy to be here.
So, as I said, together we're going to explore some of the challenges that our clergy and our religious face today, how we can better support them, and how we can make sure that they know the message that God knows them and God loves them completely. So, why don't we start perhaps, Dr. Coupe, Jim Coupe, why don't we start with you, maybe from one of your perspectives on what are some of the challenges that our clergy and religious are facing today?
Sure, good question. There are several challenges, several stressors, several sources of pressure faced by priests and religious today. And a lot of it stems from really the supply and demand issue. So the demand for ministry is still quite high. However, the supply looks much different now than it did 10, 20, 30 years ago. And consequently, more pressure is probably placed on our religious and placed on each man and woman that serves in ministry than was probably true of their predecessors. There are a few different impacts that go downstream from that, including this idea of how much time do I have that I can dedicate to my ministry and do reasonably well, and what does that come at the expense of if there's no time to take a break? And of course, that comes at the expense of self-care. So we see a lot of deficits in self-care, more specifically, taking care of yourself physically. So we see folks neglecting to sleep enough, neglecting to exercise, neglecting to eat healthy, not spending time in their social relationships, not developing hobbies, comes at the expense of personal prayer. So what happens is this expectation to continue this work product and meet these ministerial demands comes at the expense of taking care of oneself. And I think Bishop Fryer's talk that we had just heard, he really emphasized how much, it's good to get healing and come out and share how you're feeling with people and take care of yourself. That has become an issue because the men and women are not really finding the time to do that in a way that maybe was available in the past.
Oh, very well put. Very well put. Thank you. Sister Mary Lindsay, from an outpatient perspective, I'm sure a lot of what Jim says rings true for you. What are some of the stressors that you might see either on clergy or the religious that you work with?
Well, I think one of the things that I've noticed lately and been working with people a lot around and it goes, as you said, hand in hand with what Jim was saying about the supply and demand issue. Another thing that brings to the fore is that men who are rather not as experienced in ministry are being called upon to, it used to be in an older model where they would have several experiences of being maybe in a couple of different parishes and being there for years and really learning a lot of leadership, communication kind of skills in working with parishes and people. And people are being put in those positions now much earlier, much younger, with much less experience. And I think what that brings about is, people are learning on the job. And I think while that's an adequate way to learn, it also puts a lot of pressure on people. And also there's a likelihood of making more mistakes maybe in the way you handle things and do things. And I think that has contributed a lot to some of the problems that it's almost like people being asked to do things that maybe they are growing into and have had some struggles with in that process. So it's
Yeah,
almost like,
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead.
didn't mean to cut you off. From what I've heard statistically, a young, a newly ordained priest might be asked to be a pastor within 3 to 5 years of ordination, which is much younger than we ever saw before. Is that what you're seeing?
Exactly. Yeah. And, that it's necessary, but it has a whole host of problems that go with it. Something else I've also come across recently along those same lines is that people are being made pastors sooner. But in addition to that, they're also being put, like I recently had two rather young people in ministry who were recently made pastors, but also filling in for a job in the diocesan office, which years ago would have been two full-time jobs, and that's a lot. That's a lot, to put on anybody. So,
Yeah, I've seen that as well, where in the morning they might have some parish responsibilities, and in the afternoon they're over at the diocese, and back in the
mhm.
evening they're back doing their parish committees or what have you, and there's not a whole lot of personal time left for them.
No, and then you start to run into all the problems that Jim just described with letting this go, letting that go,
Yeah,
and all of that.
yeah, absolutely. Deacon Stephen, you work in our CEO department, our consultation, education, and outreach department. I'm sure all of this rings true for you. What are you seeing out in the field?
Well, I think, Deacon Jim, the simple reality is everyone is being asked to do more with less. Increased ministry responsibilities in environments in which there are fewer human resources, fewer financial resources. And that kind of squeeze pushes up against any religious or priest's resiliency and challenges them to find ways to care for themselves so that the day-to-day stressors that come and go don't become chronic stress. What we see at Saint John Vianney Center is when the stress reaches the level that is chronic, then we begin to see how the breakdown in the human person unfolds. Depression, anxiety, compulsive use of the internet, various other distractions that people that are religious and clergy are trying to use to cope with that chronic stress but aren't successful. So it's a slippery slope. And in the CEO department, we spend a lot of time out in the communities of religious and in the diocese and archdiocese trying to help religious and clergy understand how to put in place various commitments to their spiritual lives, to their physical lives, to their emotional lives, to their relational lives, so that the stress is something that they can cope with in healthy ways rather than in unhealthy ways.
Tremendous. Kristin, you have this unique perspective where you and your team members are with someone when they first come to join us here at St. John Vianney Center, and then you're with them throughout that process, and even as far as a year, maybe beyond a year after their time here, you get to see that beautiful evolution in them as people. How does all this kind of reflect in the work that you do?
Sure. And thank you, Jim. So I think that some of the challenges that we've seen is the clergy and religious, how to sustain the growth that they've achieved and accomplished with us at St. John Vianney, and the insight that they've gained during treatment, and how they're going to maintain that once they return to ministry. A transition home can be difficult or challenging, and how they're going to sustain that once they've returned, often with the same stressors that contributed to their exhaustion in the first place. So we've developed this individualized wellness plan that has identified personal triggers, potentials, obstacles, goals for continued growth. So it's really continuing care's job to continue the journey and walk with them, help them live this plan for continued wellness. So even with that structure, we continue to see individuals potentially struggling with the demands of ministry or isolation if they continue to face some emotional or spiritual challenges. In the end, if they don't have certain supports in place once they return to ministry or communities or parishes.
Yeah, those supports in place would just strike me as being one of the key things for them that may not be in place before they come to be with us or before they might hit a moment of crisis. Jim, maybe share with us a little bit more on what maybe are some of the signs that they might be struggling or maybe that they might be nearing burnout. And that sense of isolation and loneliness is probably near the top of the chart.
For sure, Jim. And I would just put a plug in for the podcast that you all did a few months ago with Dr. Don Marks on burnout. That was excellent. So I'd suggest people search that out if they're interested. But, burnout really comes from this idea of increased pressure without a sense of agency. And for a lot of the clergy, this prolonged stress and these overwhelming demands kind of take over to the point where the person doesn't feel like he or she has much control over, outcomes. So there's a few things we look for. Some are external, some are internal. One of the things that really becomes clear is people start to withdraw or become isolated. So if your parish priest is not as present as he used to be, that could be a sign. Additionally, poor self-care. So if people's hygiene is off, or if they appear to be gaining weight or losing weight, or otherwise look unhealthy, those are things to keep an eye out for. And the other thing that really is important to know is any kind of like caustic comments, negative, particularly cynical type comments. Cynicism isn't something that we see necessarily with folks when they're experiencing other kinds of mental health issues in the way that we do with burnout. Burnout really can bring that out in people. Also, other kind of mood disorders as well. The sense of being detached, drained, not connected. They may also report, dryness in spirituality, a sense really not having much of a locus of control, kind of like a cog in the machine. When you start to hear those kinds of comments, we start to think about burnout. And that formula that Dr. Marks mentions in the podcast from months ago, I think is helpful in this idea of more demands and not feeling able to really influence much in the way of those demands kind of leads to burnout.
Sister Mary, how does that ring true for you? I'm sure you see some of that in your outpatient work.
Oh, very definitely. And, I noticed we've been talking about, mostly clergy here in the beginning, but also that same supply and demand issue it's affecting religious communities, I think, a little bit different, which is also the population that we serve here. So some of the things that are happening there is the way having fewer religious, the way it's affecting congregations, and, many of them in different stages of many of the communities, people years ago that they would have entered is no longer the community that they are in today due to all the changes. And, religious communities changing, closing ministries, closing, places where they've been living and residing. And all of that has, I think, there's been a great call for people speaking on issues like grieving and transition, and because it has very much affected the population. I've seen a lot of those situations recently where it's difficult when you're aging yourself and moving into different levels of life, but you also experience it going on all around you, and if you haven't really progressed really well with all of the stages throughout the process of your life, then I find it hits some people with a great impact as it comes to their later years. And that's been I think a big difficulty for some of the people that I'm seeing. And the loneliness, I think, both in, as Jim mentioned, in the clergy and in people, I think, in all of that, you're letting go of a lot of things and a lot of relationships and a lot of people. And, so the grieving process is big and feeds into burnout and difficulties that people are experiencing in a very, very large way. I keep bumping up against that in many different ways.
Yeah, I want to key in on what you just said there, sister. We certainly want to talk about women religious and religious communities because they are impacted differently than parish priests are, in that they're living in community, and in many cases those communities are becoming smaller. We know that in many cases they are combining convents or having to relocate because their own personal community may have dwindled down to where they need to combine because it makes sense economically. And that can create some trauma and some stress, especially when they don't see newer vocations, newer novitiates coming in through the ranks. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, I think you kind of hit it right on. It's when it can sometimes feel like all loss and all giving over. And I think difficult to grasp and difficult to deal with when it can be a great source of, it's been for depression for some people, for anxiety, not so much burnout in the same way as we were talking about it before with some of the clergy, but just, raising a lot of questions of what it has. It really even feeds into life issues and what has all of this meant and what am I leaving? You think of the legacy of what you're leaving behind, and there's all kinds of questions that come up for people. And I think mostly creating feelings of loss and grieving and depression and anxiety is what I see mostly across the board, and how to deal with it and move through some of those things and still be able to find great meaning in all of it.
Kristin, how does that translate into the work you do in some of the women religious and men religious that you've worked with?
Sure. Uh, so in continuing care, we're meeting with our clients monthly. So whether it is through monthly check-ins, via telephone or in integration support team meetings, what we'll notice is an emotional shift during check-ins. So it can start subtly. There may be a sense of discouragement or isolation, or we may notice that they're starting to disconnect if we see, if we're sensing or if they're nearing burnout, excuse me. So there may be very slight, subtle cues, whether it's picked up by the support team or the coordinator themselves. So with continuing care, we'll step in a bit more intentionally, helping them revisit their wellness plan that they developed throughout their time in treatment with us, and really using the strategies that they developed in treatment, reaching out to their support systems, setting firmer boundaries, and really returning to the practices that they developed while they were in treatment with us. The burnout can really creep in pretty quickly, and we remain intentional in supporting our residents throughout their continuing care process. And we do our best to support them along the way, and really remain in contact with our contact persons and our religious sisters and brothers and priests.
Such important work. Such important work. Deacon Steven, going to switch maybe gears here a little bit to the other side of the coin. How can we better support our clergy and men and women religious, which I know is really at the heart and the core of on the preventative side of the house, what you do and your colleagues do in the CEO department. So let me just start with you a little bit. How can we, as parishioners, as laity, and just other folks, better support our clergy and men and women religious?
The two words that come into my mind as I hear you ask that question, the first word is accompaniment, and the second word is affirmation. Both of those words are positive realities. We've been talking so far in our conversation today about some of the difficulties that people experience when they aren't aware of how stress is affecting them, when they don't have positive supports in their life. But when we look at this other side of the coin, as to use your phrase, what can the people do? What can our leaders do? Our major superiors of women and men, our bishops, our vicars, and the faithful. We can affirm our clergy and religious for the ministry that they have said yes to, the vocations that they have risked taking, the sacrifices that they have made. We can say thank you and support them by inviting them into social settings that are healthy and that are life-giving. We can also remind particularly our religious women that their lives of service has had tremendous meaning, and that the grief that they're experiencing now as the demographics shift in their communities is the normal grief that occurs when we reflect on change and transition. But that doesn't in any way diminish their efforts, their sacrifices, nor does it diminish the gift of the charism that the Holy Spirit gave to their particular communities. It's really, really important that our leaders affirm those who are serving, and that our leaders also find ways to care for themselves with commitments to cultivate their spirituality with their own support across body, mind, and spirit. We have to speak from the positive because the church continues to exist. It's not our church, it's God's church. It will continue to exist, no matter what happens with shifts in demographics. And we need to acknowledge that and to affirm one another for the efforts that continue to be made. The faithful want their religious and clergy to serve them. And so their affirmation of that reality can help people to feel supported in those ministry roles that they're in. So those are just a couple of thoughts that come to my mind. Affirmation, support, and accompaniment.
That's it's fantastic, Deacon Steve. I'm going to ask you just one little quick follow-up. So you mentioned the leadership. What's one way in which leadership, if they're listening to this podcast, say, what's one way I have many men or I have many women under my care? What's one way they can show their presence or their support for them? One practical quick step.
Sure. I think bringing people together periodically for gatherings goes a long way. We're coming up on the season of Advent, and it's a time of preparation for the incarnation. What can religious leaders or leaders in religious communities and our bishops or our vicars do to gather people, sometimes in smaller groups within the presbyterate or within the religious community, to be present to them, to be at those gatherings, to say thank you, to keep an open door policy, to say if there's something on your mind, speak to me or speak to the vicar or speak to the vicar provincial, whatever the appropriate leadership person is, and to be that kind of presence and that openness rather than to be aloof or only to appear when something has gone awry. So it's a positive support. That would be the quickest, most succinct way I could respond to that.
Wonderful. Very practical. Dr. Coupe, Jim, how can the laity better support, let's talk about parish priests again for a moment. How can the laity better support their pastor, their associate pastor, the priests in residence at their parish?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I would agree with Deacon Steve about affirmation being key. One
Mhm.
point I would make though is a lot of times priests feel conflicted about saying no or setting boundaries in terms of taking their days off, their vacations, retreats, etc. So one way to affirm can be to affirm those kind of boundaries. So when Father says no, it's okay. I think there might be a sense that priests are machines who are, working and dealing in sacraments, 24/7. And I think as parishioners, we need to understand to humanize the men in this role so that they do have an opportunity to say no. They do take their breaks, vacations. If you can encourage father to follow those kind of boundaries, I think that's doing him a service, doing the parish a service. Also, opportunities for exercise or appropriate social engagement, if those are provided, and it would be appropriate to invite your parish priest with you, would be, I think, something that would be worth considering as well, to really kind of facilitate some of these areas of self-care that father may have some conflict about. If we can ease that road for him, that would be, I think, doing a service.
Absolutely, absolutely. Sister Mary Lindsay, let's talk about religious communities. How can we better support our men and women religious?
Well, I think some of the things that Deacon Steve talked about, that, I mean, obviously, the affirmation and the appreciation goes large, as he mentioned that. And I find across the board, and I can speak very personally for myself, people do. And, they will always bring up this person or that person and what that meant to them in the relationship, and all that I learned from this teacher or that teacher. And so I think people are pretty good about, but sometimes I notice, even not only with just religious, but with all these changes that are taking place. And we talked early on, we began talking about all the demands made upon people today. What I think laity need to help with is, and one example would be that I hear over and over again, like when a priest comes into a parish, and because of he's there all by himself in a parish that maybe had 3 or 4 people at one time, things are going to have to change a little bit, like mass schedules, and one person can't do what 3 or 4 people did. And sometimes, there can be less receptivity than you would like to some of those changes. And I think if people could just look at the whole picture and realize that when things change and we're working with less, you have to expect that there's going to be some kind of changes that are going to have to follow. And I think that can be a tremendous thing, to try and receive it as something that's necessary, as opposed to just something that somebody decided to do. I've heard stories over the years of a priest who was out in rural areas driving hours and hours and hours on a Sunday just to get to 3 different parishes, and just to be able to appreciate some of the changes that are going to take place, both among the religious when there's fewer of them, and the same thing with the clergy. So
Wonderful. And Kristin, same question for you. How can we better support our clergy and our men and women religious?
Sure. So I think what we've seen in continuing care is, to echo really what everyone has been saying, it's that support and affirmation, and lending the, it can be as a little as saying to a father, how are you doing? It's maintaining those boundaries. It's having those conversations when you see someone, asking how they're really doing. It can be those in leadership modeling what boundaries look like, what self-care looks like, what openness and balance is. When leadership does that, it gives permission to others to do the same. So I think it's a combination of everything. So I think there is no one right answer. It's a combination of what everything is saying and what everyone is saying, and all of that is what comes together as support. What we're seeing in continuing care is that communities can play such an important role. Communities that people live in, the communities that make up a parish, the communities that make up the presbyterate as a whole. So, we encourage people to continue to check in with their support teams, continue to check in with their support systems. So I think it's continuing to be open to the feedback, continuing to be open to saying, this is where I'm struggling, and be open to the feedback that they're receiving to say, this is where I'm at, and this is what I need.
Mhm. Beautifully said. I think the key word there is continuing. Our care for them should be continuing throughout the year. Little check-ins, little ways that we can all offer them an invitation to dinner without any expectation of blessing your house or anything, but just a casual invitation. I so often see at rectories where they get way too many baked goods at Christmas time. Maybe send them a little fruit basket instead or something healthy. But there's so many ways I think we can show our love and our support. Thank them for a wonderful homily. Thank them for the service. All for our men and women religious. It's just that steady stream of gratitude that we want to continue to express for them. Well, I just want to thank all four of you for being on the podcast today. Deacon Steve, Kristin, Sister Mary Lindsay, and Dr. Jim Coupe. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. Thank you for all you do throughout the year to support our clergy and men and women religious here at Saint John Vianney Center. And thanks to all who are listening for joining us today for our day of prayer. Thank you and God bless.
God bless
Thank
you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.